This day and time. What happened today, years ago.
Imagine, if you will, a single date on the calendar, June 21st. And it keeps popping up across the centuries. But each time it marks a definitive, a totally different kind of ending in warfare.
It is a strange coincidence, isn't it? June 21st. We've been looking at some source material, and it really highlights 3 specific moments on this date, each one a very unique military end.
That's what we're diving into today, this specific date, June 21st, and 3 events the sources focus on. First, the Battle of Vitoria, back in 1813.
Then, jumping forward, the scuttling of the German fleet at Scapa in 1919.
And finally, the final phase of the Battle of Okinawa in 1945.
Right. And our goal here is to use these sources to really unpack what happened each time. Understand the specific circumstances of these very different endings and look at their lasting impact. What do they tell us about war itself?
Yeah, because looking at them together, it's not just history trivia. You start to see some, pretty profound things about how conflicts wrap up or maybe don't wrap up neatly, and the consequences that ripple outwards.
Okay, so let's start with the earliest one. Vitoria, June 21st, 1813. This feels like, the sources call it the most classical military end of the 3 we're looking at.
A proper battle deciding things. And by 1813, Napoleon's situation in Spain. That wasn't great, was it? The sources describe Spain as this ongoing headache for him.
Oh, absolutely. He put his brother Joseph on the throne back in 1808, and that just ignited massive resistance. You had guerrilla warfare all over the country, plus the regular Allied armies fighting him. It was draining French resources constantly. Napoleon himself famously called it his Spanish ulcer.
And that ulcer was getting worse by 1813, partly because of what happened in Russia the year before.
Exactly. The disastrous retreat from Moscow in 1812 had just decimated his veteran troops. And crucially, he had to pull elite units out of Spain to rebuild his main army.
Ah, okay. So the French forces left in Spain were weaker, maybe less experienced?
Definitely weaker. And the command structure was a bit fragmented, maybe demoralized too.
Whereas Wellington, leading the Allies, he was getting stronger.
Much stronger, yeah. He'd received significant reinforcements. He had this large, combined army, British, Portuguese, Spanish troops, something like 121,000 men altogether. He had the numbers.
But it wasn't just about numbers, was it? The sources mention Wellington's strategy, this genius plan. It wasn't just a head-on clash.
No, not at all. That was the key. Wellington knew the ground. He planned a feint attack right in the center to pin the French down. But the real move, that was a huge flanking maneuver.
A flank? How?
He marched his main force way up north secretly through these really rugged mountains, basically went right around the French defensive lines.
Wow. So they weren't expecting that at all?
Not really, no. It completely outflanked them. It forced Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Jourdan to pull back rapidly, abandoning key cities like Madrid, Burgos. They were trying to retreat and regroup.
And Wellington moved fast to cut them off.
Super fast. He managed to intercept their main retreat route back towards France, basically trapping the bulk of the French army near the town of Vitoria.
Okay, so that leads us right to the battle itself, June 21st. What did the forces look like on the day?
Well, Wellington's flanking maneuver really paid off in terms of numbers at the key point. The French had maybe 57 to 60,000 troops and about 153 cannons.
Okay.
The Allies brought something like 81, maybe up to 90,000 men to the field, though with fewer guns, around 96. But still, a clear advantage in manpower where it counted.
And the battle itself? The sources break it down. It wasn't just one big melee.
Oh, it unfolded in about 4 key stages, showing how Wellington kind of systematically dismantled their position. First, General Hill's forces took a high ground, the La Puebla Heights, always important.
Always gotta have the high ground, right.
Then came the decisive bit, stage 2. British troops managed to seize a key bridge, the Tres Ponientes Bridge. This was the main flanking force breaking through, getting behind the French lines.
Ah, so the flank attack worked. They were in the French rear.
Pretty much, yeah. Threatening their lines of communication, their retreat. Then stage 3, you had General Graham moving to cut off the main road back to France, sealing the trap. And Spanish troops under Longa even routed part of the Imperial Guard.
So the French were basically surrounded and collapsing.
Exactly. Stage 4 was just a complete rout. The French army broke. They abandoned almost all their artillery, wagons, everything, just trying to escape. Joseph Bonaparte himself barely got away. A total decisive victory for Wellington.
And the aftermath sounds pretty chaotic. The sources mention huge amounts of plunder.
Oh, absolutely. The French army had been looting Spain for years, and their baggage train was immense. Allied soldiers captured unbelievable amounts of treasure, art, gold. Some of that art, famously, ended up forming the core of the Wellington collection in London.
But strategically, the impact was even bigger, wasn't it? This wasn't just winning a battle.
No, this was it for Napoleon in Spain. Vitoria effectively ended French control of the Iberian Peninsula. It was a massive boost for the Sixth Coalition forming against Napoleon across Europe, and definitely played a part in his bigger defeat later that year at Leipzig.
Okay, so Vitoria fits that classical military end idea perfectly. Decisive battle, clear victor, major strategic consequences, and ending determined by force of arms.
Right. Now jump forward exactly 106 years, another June 21st, 1919, Scapa flow. And this is, well, it's a totally different kind of end. Nothing like Vitoria.
Yeah, the sources call this one the symbolic end of honor.
Yeah.
This is about the German high seas fleet scuttling itself, right? Sinking their own ship.
Exactly. The context is crucial. World War I is over, the armistice is signed, German U-boats have surrendered. But the fate of their massive surface fleet, the high seas fleet, their pride and joy is up in the air.
The Allies couldn't agree on what to do with them.
No. As a temporary measure, 70 of Germany's most powerful warships were ordered to sail to the British naval base at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, way up north in Scotland. They interned there under guard.
And the German sailors were just stuck there.
Pretty much. The crews were cut down drastically. From about 20,000 men needed to operate the fleet fully, they were left with skeleton crews, maybe 1,800 sailors total just to maintain the ships. They were isolated, communications were poor, living in this kind of limbo.
While the politicians argued.
Right, Britain basically wanted the fleet destroyed or sunk. They didn't want those powerful ships falling into anyone else's hands, especially not France or Italy, who wanted to divide them up as war reparations. So this diplomatic wrangling just dragged on.
And the German commander there, Admiral von Reuter, he felt cornered.
He did. He was getting patchy information, hearing rumors the Allies were about to break the terms of the armistice and just seize the ships outright. And he was operating under a strong naval tradition, an order of honor, you might say, that German warships must never be surrendered to the enemy. So believing capture was imminent, he decided to take matters into his own hands.
By sinking the entire fleet on June 21st.
Precisely. At 11:20 in the morning, he gave the prearranged signal, a flag message. Paragraph 11, confirm. And across the fleet, the skeleton crews immediately started opening the seacocks, smashing internal pipes, doing whatever they could to flood and scuttle their own vessels.
That must have been an incredible sight. Dozens of massive warships just sinking themselves.
Utterly surreal. It was systematic. They knew exactly what to do. In the end, 52 of the 74 interned ships were successfully sunk, including almost all the major ones. 10 battleships, 5 battle cruisers, 5 light cruisers, 32 destroyers. Gone. Sent to the bottom of Scapa Flow by their own crews.
Did the British guards try to stop it?
They were caught completely by surprise. They scrambled boats and tried to intervene, boarding some ships, beaching others, but it was too late for most.
And tragically, people died.
Yes. In the confusion, British forces opened fire on some of the German sailors abandoning ship or resisting efforts to stop the sinking. 9 German sailors were killed. The sources point out the grim irony. They were the very last German casualties of World War I, killed months after the fighting stopped.
Wow. So what was the legacy of this? How was von Reuter seen back in Germany?
Largely as a hero, he was captured, obviously, but back home, he was seen as having upheld the Navy's honor, preventing its humiliation.
And ironically, it kind of solved the Allies' problem, didn't it?
It did, yeah. Especially for the British. Suddenly, the argument about dividing up the best ships was moot. They were at the bottom of the sea. So von Reuter's act unintentionally handed Britain the outcome it preferred.
Did it set any kind of precedent?
It did. In World War II, the German Navy had a similar contingency plan called Plan Regenbogen to scuttle ships rather than let them be captured. And today, the wrecks at Scapa Flow, they're still there. It's a world-famous site for scuba divers.
And the meaning has shifted over time, too.
It has. The sources mention that while it was born from conflict and defiance, the site and the story have now become something of a symbol of Anglo-German reconciliation, which is interesting.
So, Scapa Flow gives us a completely different end. Not a military defeat, but a deliberate act of self-destruction. An ending chosen by the commander, driven by honor and defiance, not imposed by the enemy.
Exactly. To June 21st, two wildly different endings. Now let's jump forward again, just a few decades this time, to 1945, Okinawa. And the sources call this one the bloody end and strategic turning point.
Right at the end of World War II in the Pacific. And Okinawa was strategically vital, wasn't it?
Absolutely critical. The U.S. plan was to use Okinawa as the main base, the staging area, for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Taking it was seen as essential almost regardless of the cost.
And the invasion itself, Operation Iceberg, which started April 1st, 1945.
Yeah.
It was huge.
Just massive. One of the biggest amphibious operations ever. The Allies threw close to 500,000 troops at it, supported by over 1,300 ships. It showed how determined they were.
But the Japanese weren't planning a conventional defense, were they? They knew they couldn't stop that force head on.
No, their commander, General Ushijima, he implemented what's called a deep defense. He used the island's terrain, mountains, ridges, extensive cave systems, especially around the Shuri Line fortifications.
So, digging in deep.
Exactly. His goal, with his roughly 110,000 troops, wasn't really to win in the traditional sense. It was to inflict the maximum possible casualties on the Americans, to make the price of taking Okinawa, and by extension invading Japan itself, seem horrifyingly high, a strategy of attrition.
And they succeeded in making it horrific. 82 days of fighting.
Brutal fighting. The sources use terms like Typhoon of Steel, Hell on Earth, specific battles for places like Sugarloaf Hill, Kakazu Ridge, Hacksaw Ridge. They were just grinding incredibly bloody struggles for every yard of ground.
And this was also where the kamikaze attacks became a major factor, wasn't it?
A huge factor. Okinawa saw the peak of the kamikaze strategy. The sources say around 1,900 suicide attacks were launched against the Allied fleet offshore.
1,900. Wow. The damage must have been immense.
Devastating. They sank 36 U.S. ships outright, damaged nearly 370 others. The U.S. Navy actually suffered its heaviest losses of the entire war at Okinawa, about 5,000 sailors killed just from the naval actions.
And beyond the military toll, the cost for Okinawan civilians was catastrophic.
Just horrific. Caught completely in the middle. The sources estimate somewhere between 100,000 and maybe even 150,000 Okinawan civilians died. Killed in the crossfire, forced into mass suicides by Japanese troops, used as human shields. An absolute humanitarian disaster.
So against this backdrop of utter carnage, how did this specific end play out around June 21st?
Well, the main Japanese stronghold, Shuri Castle, had fallen a bit earlier, forcing Ushijima's remaining forces into a final pocket in the south of the island. By June 21st and 22nd, organized resistance was basically collapsing.
And Ushijima made a final decision.
Yes. Recognizing the end on the night of June 21st going into the 22nd, General Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, General Cho, committed ritual suicide harakiri in their command post cave.
So that act essentially marked the end of organized Japanese defense on Okinawa, even if some fighting continued.
Pretty much, yes. It was the symbolic military conclusion. But the real significance of Okinawa's end, the thing that makes it stand out, is what came after, driven by the sheer cost of it all.
The cost was just staggering, wasn't it?
Unbelievable. For the U.S., over 49,000 casualties, including more than 12,500 dead or missing. For the Japanese military, around 117,000 killed virtually their entire garrison. And then those horrifying civilian numbers on top of it.
And the sources are really clear. Experiencing that level of resistance, that cost, directly changed American thinking about invading Japan.
Absolutely. The ferocity of the defense, the willingness to fight to the last man, the kamikazes. It terrified U.S. planners when they thought about invading the home islands. War Department studies at the time were projecting just astronomical casualty figures for Operation Downfall.
Like how high?
The numbers cited are shocking. Estimates range from 1.7 up to 4 million U.S. casualties, with maybe 400,000 to 800,000 American deaths, and potentially 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths.
Unthinkable numbers.
Completely. And the sources explicitly state that the bloody end at Okinawa, the sheer cost of that victory, was a major factor, perhaps the decisive factor, in President Truman's decision to use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki a few weeks later. to try and force a surrender without that dreaded invasion.
So Okinawa's end wasn't just the end of a battle. It was an ending so costly, so horrifying, it reshaped the entire strategy for ending the World War itself. It led directly to the nuclear age.
Precisely. It's an end defined by its devastating price tag, a price that forced a fundamental reevaluation and led to an entirely new and arguably more terrible path to concluding the wider conflict.
It really is quite something to lay these three June 21st out like this. Vitoria, the clear battlefield win, Scapa flow, that symbolic act of defiance, sinking your own ships, and Okinawa, the victory that cost so much it changed the course of history.
They really do offer this incredible snapshot, don't they? You see the evolution of warfare reflected in how these ends came about. From Napoleonic maneuver warfare through the industrial scale and naval codes of World War I, right up to the total war, the strategic bombing, the immense human cost of World War II.
It definitely makes you think about what ending a war actually means. It's
Yeah.
clearly not always straightforward, not always just about one side winning a final battle.
Not at all. There are so many factors: military, political, cultural notions like honor, and sheer human cost. Understanding how these specific conflicts reach these particular points on June 21st, it helps us think about the complexities of conflict resolution more broadly, or sometimes the lack of it.
So a final thought for you to consider, perhaps. We've seen three very different ways a conflict reached a significant end on this single date. One through decisive battle, one through self-destruction based on honor, one through a horrific cost that led to using a world-changing weapon. What does that range tell us about the very nature of victory itself, and maybe the ultimate, often unpredictable price of war? Something to chew on.
Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more history daily.